So last Saturday, the group of majority young boys of the National Socialist Network did a big promotional stunt, let me say, out in the city. Got a big banner saying mass deportations now, and they quickly marched and they stood outside the Immigration Museum, Fed Square, and then the Flinders Street steps. Really didn't appear to be a very planned stunt. A lot of awkward silences, according to people watching. Kind of as though they didn't have a clear idea of what exactly they were going to do once they were there. This is belied by the fact that they obviously had prepared for it. People had showed up, I reckon, from regionally and interstate in order to buff up the numbers. Timestamps of the videos I've seen show that they were doing their thing at about 4 p.m. 4:10, they were standing outside Flinders Steps. And by 4:20, the rest of them had scampered while Jacob Hersant here and another 3 or 4 people from the NSN were being arrested. So it was all over in about 10-15 minutes. So to be clear about what this was, it was a promotional flash mob performance. Recently, to promote his new album, Eminem's PR team arranged for a pretty cringe stunt to occur in New York City. A bunch of people got together and they did a little flash mob dressed up as Slim Shady. And the point there was to get young boys to buy Eminem's new album. The point with the NSN rally, to get a group of autistic young boys to message the NSN contact bot. That is what NSN do, and all they have done for some time. It is they try to use the mainstream media and their own viral material to recruit autistic young boys. I wanted to briefly communicate this in the previous release of this same video, that I know it to be the case, from my knowledge of individual members of the NSN, that the majority, or at least a substantial number of their young cohort, the young boys that they recruit from, happen to be people with an autism diagnosis. This is not a guess of mine, this is something I know to be the case. However, in my haste to communicate that, or the language that I used, it seemed to people that I was implying a causality between the state or the condition or the experience of having autism and being on the far right. Certainly not my intention to imply any kind of causality. Certainly not my intention to imbue the experience of having autism with essentially far-right properties. So it was my pleasure to take down the previous version of this work with its shitty, sloppy language, rephrase things a bit, make my position clearer within boundaries pertaining to privacy, of course, and re-upload. Not just because I didn't want to piss off comrades and people whose opinions I trust, but because I think this important point is too important to let fall down due to sloppy language. So let me reiterate that I know for a fact that a lot of the young male cohort, the targets of grooming in the NSN, are young boys with an autism diagnosis. Every vulnerable young boy who joins this group has been the subject of specific, targeted, individual to individual or group to individual, or a bit of both, grooming. It might have taken place over a little while, it might have taken place over a long period of time. The far right pride themselves on their ability to do this. They pride themselves on providing careful pathways for individual people to join their fold. Any group, any cohort of isolated, vulnerable young men found online and groomed into something will probably find themselves receptive to that grooming. It so happens that the leadership of the NSN, including Sil, have experience as residential and youth workers. A formerly senior NSN member, Stuart von Moger, he's now out of the fold, was caught attempting to join an NDIS support service for vulnerable young people. He was caught and he was subject to a background check that was done far too late into the proceedings when he told the agency he only wanted to work with young men. That's when alarm bells started ringing for them. Now again, while I am not implying causality, there are interesting studies that are being done that take into consideration what's going on here and why is it that neurodivergence, including but not limited to autism, can make someone vulnerable to the attentions of groomers like those in the NSN. An important consideration is that neurodivergence, like autism, can be a compounding factor for the social isolation that these parasites prey upon. So to be clear, we might be saying here that loneliness among young men is the real problem here. However, it might be that neurodivergence is a compounding factor for that isolation, and that would therefore explain why there's so many young men in the NSN who have been groomed into that fold who have an autism diagnosis. Another thing that predatory groups like the NSN are actively exploiting is the need among many neurodivergent people for rules, order, structure and predictability. I want to remind you once again that none of these susceptibilities or predispositions are things, nor are we implying that they are, that draw people experiencing autism to the far right per se, because once again, these are active outreach grooming campaigns being conducted by these predators.
As at the 22nd of July, with the data that we have, and since July 2021, we've conducted operational activity against 27 individuals that were 17 years old or younger, and the youngest of them being 12 years old.
What we're seeing in our countering violent extremism intervention programs is that almost half of the participants are under the age of 18. IMVE participants are significantly more likely to have a mental health condition.
What I'm all about in this house is cultivating an understanding of exactly who the fuck our political opponents are and exactly how they exploit vulnerable young people. And it's important that we have a clear understanding in this house of exactly how they work, because we're about to look at people who have anything but, and in fact are responsible for propagating a gross misunderstanding of how these people work. Most of the primary poles of information and resource that most people seem to think are responsible for dealing with these problems in society either have no fucking idea what they're talking about with respect to these people, or they're at complete cross purposes. Like, let's look at the media's handling at this, for example.
A man's been arrested after a neo-Nazi demonstration on the steps of Flinders Street. Live now to Mark Santomartino, who's at the scene. Mark, what can you tell us?
Pete, police stopped and spoke to 6 of these men, but they've only officially arrested 1, and 9 News understands that is 24-year-old Jacob Hersant, who was officially the first Victorian to ever be charged with performing the Nazi salute in public. He was part of a group of 30 masked men that gathered at Federation Square around 4:20 this afternoon. They were chanting offensive things and holding up a banner which read "Mass Deportations Now." They were filmed by members of the public who told them they were Nazi scum, at which point they moved across the road to Flinders Street Station itself and hung that sign up between the clocks. That is where police moved in. The group quickly dispersed. As I mentioned, they stopped around 6 of those men and spoke to them at the scene. However, only 1 arrest has been made, Mr. Hersant. He's still being interviewed by police tonight, Pete. However, I understand that if he is to be charged, he'll be charged with an offence of causing a gross offence while in public. That is yet to happen though, Pete. We'll bring you an update if we can.
Now, you might say they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't, in the sense that if we don't talk about them in mainstream media and simply allow these things to go by unmentioned, then they get accused of ignoring the problem. However, the fact of the matter is that NSN headed out, as we said before, specifically with the intention of getting the mainstream media to promote them so that they would get material that's as salacious as that piece that we just saw, so that they can recruit little boys on Telegram. Cross purposes part I mentioned earlier, well, look, they're salacious. They make for content. They make for salacious content. Some of the worst content we've seen was the a current affairs special from some time ago, the part 2 of which involved an interview, heaven forbid, with Tom Sewell. So in this sense, we can see how the media are using the NSN in the same way that the NSN are using the media. But there's an even worse problem of opportunism at the moment, because some of the people that they're getting in to talk about this problem are both completely unequipped to talk about it, and in fact are using this problem, this real problem facing autistic young men and the people that they might make their victims in the future if they achieve their political goals. In this unforgivable Australian piece, they get in the Executive Council of Australian Juries co-CEO Alex Rivchin, who's only got one target in mind. It's people who are protesting against the genocide taking place in Palestine. Look at what he says here. He goes, soaring levels of anti-Semitism since October the 7th, driven by radical anti-Israel groups and their enablers, has shown the far right that this is the right time to escalate their own public displays of hatred. Oh, they're being shown, are they, Alex? This guy doesn't give a shit. I've talked about him in previous videos. He doesn't care about the far right. The only utility of the far right to him is its usefulness to him in being able to say, wow, you know, the far left are as bad as them now. Couldn't care less. Anything I've said about their recruitment, their strategies, the potential dangers of them, it is simply not of interest to him. And so yet he is given a national platform to completely misrepresent this problem and misdiagnose this problem in order to achieve his own political outcomes using these autistic young men, just like the NSN do.
I will focus on the active club strategy.
As I said earlier, there is a problem here in that these pillars of society that are perceived, I think, by most normies, most people, to be responsible for doing something about this problem and whatever its ramifications are. They're either misdiagnosing the problem, they've known fucking nothing about it, or they're using it for their own purposes. I looked at media before. Now let's look at government. So who's this guy? This is Alexander Ritzman. He's part of a group called the Counter Extremism Project, and he is presenting before this inquiry, a Senate inquiry into right-wing extremism. And as he just said, he's talking about the active club model. That is a model for recruitment, retention, for training of neo-Nazis that's really popular with groups around the world. This is where all the little boys are meant to go. The focus is on recruiting, and then you retain by keeping the young boys fit, active, they do fitness, and then they get politicised along the way. Let's let him get into it. He should explain a little bit for you.
And I will highlight how this development is relevant for Australian policymakers and law enforcement. The white supremacist active clubs are arguably the largest and fastest growing violent extreme right network worldwide, with more than 100 groups in at least 25 countries. At the time of the writing of the report for this committee, there were no active clubs in Australia. But we highlighted that it is very likely that this strategy will be implemented in Australia in the near future. And just 6 weeks later, a Crow Eater active club was founded in South Australia.
I have a lot of faith that my audience, who are very literate in this kind of thing, will already have picked a few problems here. But let's just make it clear for those who aren't so much. Australia has had active clubs for years. Tom Sewell is one of the world's leading proponents of the active club model. He is sought out as a leading neo-Nazi figure by other international active club model proponents as a source of advice and guidance. This is not a secret. This has been the subject of mainstream media reporting, not just anti-fascist reporting, for years. To not know this, you have to know nothing about fascism in Australia.
Thomas Sewell, leader of the violent extreme right European Australian movement and the National Socialist Network, founded an active club called Crow Eater, as mentioned.
This absolute mongoose is not from Australia, so he doesn't really understand that Crow Eater is simply referencing Adelaide people. It's just the Adelaide chapter of NSN/EAM. He doesn't know that. He's got no info. He's got no context. He's got nothing.
So in every country that has violent right-wing extremists that have the need to change the way they look to the public and to law enforcement, the active club strategy is potentially a plug-and-play solution to that. But of course, they would also have to change. And Thomas Sowell was not able, the National Socialist Network so far was not able to change their appearances, their propaganda, and their activities. And I guess that is the reason why they dropped off that strategy for now.
The NSN is the successor group to the Lad Society. The Lad Society was a clandestine active club. It didn't openly espouse its Hitlerite views. That was the model then. He made a decision after that to become openly Hitlerite neo-Nazi. Tom Sowell didn't fail at rebranding a group to hide his neo-Nazi credentials or his Hitlerite views. He went in completely the opposite direction. And again, I know that my audience has a literacy on this stuff, so I feel a bit redundant talking to you about that. But, you know, I'm just talking to you guys on fucking YouTube. This guy's talking to the Senate.
Thomas Sowell is not capable at the moment to adapt the active club strategy, but he has tried.
This man obviously has the cure for whatever imposter syndrome is. It's incredible to have the courage to speak before a Senate inquiry about subject matter he's completely information free on. Amazing. For all that, this is just, some guy. However, the next guy is not just some guy. Listen to this.
Are you aware of this phenomenon of so-called active clubs, which, just to quote from some of the evidence we received, are seeking to build a shadow militia while hiding in plain sight, end quote. That's how they're described in the US.
So, apologies, Chair, I wasn't listening to the early evidence. I know my staff were. I'm not familiar with the terminology active clubs, but I'm very familiar with white supremacists, accelerationists, neo-Nazis, people of that ideological belief.
So that's the head of ASIO, Mike Burgess. He's been asked to appear before a Senate inquiry on right-wing extremism, focused, it seems, primarily, obviously, on the chief proponents of right-wing extremism being the National Socialist Network in Australia, and he doesn't know about the primary model that they've used to structure all of their groups around for the past 6 years. Cool, let's give these guys more funding. Let's get some more spies going. Let's allocate them another 50% funding. Let's go. Here's the problem with this shit. Now you've got the media, some outlets of whom have already for years reported on active clubs, are now reporting this shit as being the news. The funny thing about that to me is that if you go back to 2018, you'll find that the ABC was the first mainstream media outlet in Australia to discuss active clubs and the model. So all it takes is one idiot in the Senate to just memory hole all of this background. So my line's always been one about community organising, anti-fascist organising, being part of a united left front, and we have a very energised one with all the pro-Palestinian activism at the moment. I hope that energy is ready there to turn back on these pricks whenever they do public-facing stuff. Because remember, a lot of these flash mobs, they're not happening with advance notice, because the last time the NSN gave advance notice, they got mogged by Sean Bedlam, who just stood in front of all of them and made them look like fuckwits. Or, Cafe Gummo late last year, they got bashed and they ran away. So they don't want to do that again. I just want people to be ready for that kind of thing, and to be organised and to be part of a smart, energised left, ready to go with anti-fascist principles. I always ask for that.
There's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of developing some careful and ethical media practices in terms of how right-wing extremism is reported on.
But since I chose to focus on the uselessness, generally speaking, of government and media in responding to these people, I did want to make a caveat, after having looked at that Senate inquiry, that it's not all hopeless, and the inquiry wasn't all hopeless. You had legends like this guy, Jordan McSweeney, who presented with Imogen Richards on a variety of things, and they addressed some of the problems with media and criminalisation and such. Let's hear from them.
And I would note, indeed, that this is actually 2 points within the Christchurch call, which, as I understand it, Australia has signed up to. And I would say that we're perhaps yet to see much action on that. And as per the Christchurch call, right, there are calls to support best media practice to avoid sensationalist reporting and reporting that inadvertently amplifies violent extremist content. Now, of course, a free and impartial press is vital. I'm not at all suggesting that the Australian government should tell media how to do their job, but certainly provide space, whether that's through, I don't know, maybe roundtables for media practitioners to engage with experts in this space, whether it's funding for research into media best practice, or indeed developing a set of guidelines, as we already have for helping media and industry develop guidelines, as we already have for reporting on sensitive topics like suicide, to adapt these kinds of principles to ensure harm minimisation reporting on right-wing extremism.
One of the risks of taking a criminalising sort of approach, apart from or just exclusively trying to address a structural issue through this lens, is that we're treating the symptom rather than the root cause, so it's less effectual. It can also itself do things like harden anti-establishment sentiments and really sort of cement certain types of in-group, out-group sort of beliefs and ideas about persecution, as opposed to CVE and other measures, I guess, that we have seen to address types of violence which don't necessarily reflect the prejudice inherent to mainstream institutions and histories. The sort of white supremacist far right is very much drawing on legacies, as Jordan mentioned in our opening statement, of colonisation. There's a lot of the imagery of groups like the National Socialist Network on their various pages on various platforms are celebrating certain histories from within Australia. So I suppose addressing those and not exceptionalising is potentially, I think, has more potential than some of the sometimes criminogenic approaches of just securitising and criminalising through the criminal justice system. Yeah.
I include that because I think they made really interesting points. I will put a link to the inquiry hearing in full in the description if you want to listen to them. They're after about an hour or so they come on, and I think every word is worth listening to. I take 2 of their brains over 100 CVE hacks and spooks who don't know what they're fucking talking about. And I, generally speaking, wanted to, be fair and say not everyone's an idiot on this matter. There are good people like these two speaking out in the right environments, to government and about the media and such, doing a good job. So not everyone's an idiot. It's just most of them are. Thank you, legends, for your time, and thank you for your support. It's your support that keeps me able to make the content. Then I can make the time to make the content, and it keeps me independent as fuck. See you next time. Thank you.